I've said before that RC racing is only a small part of the RC hobby as a whole, and that's still true. But to say that RC racing on its own is a small hobby is somewhat short-sighted. There are many different types of ground RC racing out there, and whereas some may be locked to certain regions of the world, they are out there. That's why in this video I'm going to go over as many different types of RC racing out there as I can possibly find, from the mainstream to the obscure. Before we begin, however, I'd like to remind you to hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It helps feed my everlasting need for online clout and helps bring my channel to others who may not have found it yet. Without further delay, let's begin. Before we jump into the types of racing, we better learn the actual structure of these races and how they work for the most part. Now, it's important to note that not every race out there will follow this exact formula, but for most of the time, this is the structure that RC races follow. First, we have open practice. Open practice is exactly what it sounds like. It's a time when you're allowed to run on the track freely for however long your battery lasts to get a feel for how your car performs. This usually occurs very early on in the day or weekend depending on the race program's size. After this, we have controlled practice, and in larger events, seeding. In most large events like Psycho Nitro Blast or Masters of Dirt, there are many people who all want to practice at the same time. There needs to be some sort of structure to how time on the track is distributed fairly. This is where controlled practice comes in. A certain number of people are allowed onto the driver's stand at a time, usually 10 to 20 depending on the size of the track, and they are given a certain amount of time allowed on the track with their cars. After this time is completed, they go out and marshal for the next 10 to 20 people. During these practice sessions, drivers are also sometimes being sorted by their fastest 3 consecutive laps. They are then placed into qualifier groups based on those lap times. This way, the fast drivers are grouped with other fast drivers, and slow drivers, like me, are grouped with other slow drivers. After this, we have qualifying. This is kind of complicated to explain, but I'll do my best. In qualifying, everyone is on their own clock. What does this mean? Basically, during qualifying, you need to do as many laps as possible in a certain amount of time, usually 5 to 10 minutes, again depending on the size of the program. That's why during qualifying, it's not advantageous to race others, nor is it advantageous to block others from passing you. You technically aren't racing each other, you're racing the clock to see how many laps you can put in. This is why also so many people tell you to let someone faster than you pass, especially during qualifying. Because if you don't, you kind of mess up their qualifying and yours depending if you crash from the pressure. How many qualifiers there are usually depends on the program, but I personally haven't seen many go past 3 rounds. After each round, there is usually a resort of drivers depending on their placements in the previous round of qualifying. Lastly, we have the mains. The main event. Depending on your best qualifying run, you are put into a specific main for your class. Say each main has 10 drivers. If you qualified 1 through 10, well congrats, you secured a spot in the A main. If you qualified 11 through 20th, you're in the B main, and so on and so forth. Don't fret if you didn't make the big show through qualifying, however. There's still a chance you can make it via bumps. Now, not every race program has bumps, but many do, so I'll explain them anyway. Basically, if you come in second or first in a lower main, you get to bump up into the main right above it. A good example will be when I bumped from the B main in Short Course Truck at Masters of Dirt into the A main. And lastly, we have the A mains themselves. And yes, I said mains as in plural. Sometimes at very large events like the Reedy race or most larger 8th scale electric races, the drivers who make it into the A main are put into a sort of final tourney. You're allotted a certain amount of points depending on your placement, and after what is usually 3 runs, the one with the most or least points depending on how they want to score it, wins. That means you could win the first main, but if you DNF or do not finish the second and third race, you're pretty much out. The reason they have this system in place is twofold. 1 is so electric drivers can have as much track time as their nitro counterparts, and 2 to reward consistent wins and consistent driving. Nitro races, on the other hand, can go on for well over an hour due to their nature of being able to continuously run after pit stops, so a triple A main nitro races are a rarity. Now that we've gone over the races usually work, let's go over the different types of races and classes there are out there. Let's start with the type of racing I'm most familiar with. 10 scale off-road racing. There are many different classes in 10 scale off-road racing that I've gone over in another video, so I won't go over them in too much detail this time around, but I will go over them in some detail. You have, of course, the premier classes of 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive buggy, and the side classes of 2-wheel drive stadium truck, 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive short course truck, and 4-wheel drive stadium truck, or more commonly known as mini truggy. 10 scale races tend to be held at indoor facilities due to a few reasons, like for example not having to worry about weather for the most part, and having more control over the track conditions. The surfaces you usually encounter in 10 scale off-road racing are probably the most varied of any race type out there. You've got outdoor dirt, indoor hard packed dirt, indoor clay, black carpet, gray carpet, AstroTurf, and sometimes even grass. These track surfaces are usually regional for the most part. For example, AstroTurf is very rarely run in the US, but in Europe it's probably the most common track surface type. In terms of stock versus mod, again I won't go into the specifics between the two as I literally just made a video on that topic, but I will say they both have their ups and downs in choosing between the two. Just recently I started to decide to run mod for the most part due to cost reasons. If you want to learn about stock versus mod, I'll put an annotation in the video and leave a link in the description. Whatever you end up picking, 10 scale off-road is probably one of the more budget-friendly types of racing out there, so I'd highly recommend it to a beginner for that reason alone. On the other hand of the coin, we have on-road racing. On-road races tend to be held at indoor carpet tracks, but outdoor asphalt tracks are common too. Much like off-road racing, there are many different types of classes for on-road racing, with the two premier classes being 12 scale pan cars and 10 scale touring cars, both having mod and stock classes. You also have the vintage classes and US GT classes. On-road racing unfortunately isn't as popular as off-road racing due to it not being as dramatic as off-road racing with no jumps and all. Couple that with the fact that touring car prices can be a bit stupid, and you have a class that could be a lot bigger, but unfortunately just isn't, which is a shame because if I was to recommend any type of racing out there for beginners, money no object, it would be on-road. It teaches you the fundamentals of racing as a whole, like carrying speed through corners and choosing the right lines. Not to mention a lot of grassroots type classes like Tamiya trucks and Tamiya mini cars are absolutely perfect for a beginner. They're easy to build, and because they're not going very fast, you don't have to worry about braking as much. Unfortunately, at least in the southeast US, on-road racing is very scarce. What isn't scarce in the US is the next class I want to talk about. A scale is a single step up in terms of size, speed, and cost from 10th scale. As I haven't gone over the classes of A scale in detail before on this channel, let's go over them a bit. Now it's important to note that each class I mention will be 4-wheel drive, so keep that in mind for a bit later. The premier class for 8th scale racing is probably Nitro 8th scale buggy. This is the class that requires the most from you, not just as a driver, but as a builder, a tuner, and a mechanic. Tuning a nitro engine is something I have very little understanding of, and even more so of their specs and regulations for racing. What I will say is that you usually need to tune them based on the outside temperature. This is also true of nitro chuggy as well. Nitro truggies are basically wider, heavier, and more powerful nitro buggies. They have a lot more manageable drive, but also more expensive to maintain, especially in the tire department. The nitro classes are by far the most involved you're going to get in RC. They can also be the most frustrating. But when everything goes right, and you win with a buggy or truggy you tuned, set up, and built, nothing can come close to that feeling of euphoria. I recently got to drive a nitro buggy for the first time and it was really fun. It was nice having auditory feedback of my throttle inputs. Will I be running nitro in the near future? Probably not due to costs, but maybe in the far future when I'm more financially stable. What I will be running in the near future is e-buggy. Thanks to the advent of brushless systems, electric buggies can now match the speed of nitro buggies. Now, from the outside looking in, these e-buggies can look like absolute monsters of torque and power, and if things go wrong, they absolutely can be. Surprisingly though, I'd say that a well set up e-buggy is much easier to drive than almost anything in the 10th scale world, especially in the 10th scale 2-wheel drive world, mostly due to the 4-wheel drive. Granted, the initial cost of e-buggies can be very daunting, especially if you buy your stuff new. In my video on costs of RC, I specifically glossed over 8th scale because of how much they can truly cost. I'm talking about more than I spent on my car kinds of money. And the constant cost of tires can eat into your budget, which is why buying used stuff is usually the best idea for budget-minded hobbyists. Which is what I'm going to do. E-truggies are probably what I'd most recommend to a beginner if that isn't too concerned about costs, as they are the easiest to drive of the 4 and probably the most durable. As for where 8th scale races are usually held, they're usually held at outdoor facilities as they need a lot of space to be able to stretch their legs, so to speak. Indoor spaces are expensive these days and not so many indoor spots that can actually handle 8th scale cars out there. Those large indoor races like Psycho Nitro Blasts are on tracks that are only built once a year. Also, due to certain laws depending on where you live, you aren't allowed to run a nitro car in a small confined space. The track you're seeing now is too small to run nitro cars indoors, if that gives you an idea. The surfaces tend to be pretty similar as well. Outdoor hardpack dirt is usually the norm, however AstroTurf is sometimes used in some tracks in Europe. Oval racing is pretty much what it says on the tin. The track is an oval, and you race on it. Like full-size oval racing, it's mostly region-locked to the United States, specifically the southeastern United States. It's very easy to laugh at oval racing and say the only people who are into it are backwater hicks, but that's not really the case. Only partially. Yes, it does have its roots in bootlegging, but there's a little bit more that goes into oval racing than you might think. Let's go over the classes first. First, you have the Premier class, the sprint car. These cars are for the most part built to simulate how a real sprint car would look and perform. They have solid rear axles and generally slide around a lot. You also have your SCT-based class, Stock Slash, Mud Boss, which is basically a modified Slash class, and a buggy-based class called Street Stock. They all have their own rules and regulations, but they all have something in common. They're all designed to look and act scale. You'll sometimes even see little drivers in sprint cars from time to time. The four main surfaces you'll see in oval will be pretty much the same as off-road racing as a whole, minus the turf and adding paved tracks. Now I'm not going to lie, oval racing does not really appeal to me. When you get a really close race where you're door-to-door the whole time with a sprinkling of contact here and there, it can be very fun to both watch and drive, and it's more complicated than just turning left over and over again for 7 minutes. It just looks like that, and that's why it doesn't appeal to me. What I will say is it's probably the easiest type of RC racing to do, both in cost and in ease of driving. Drifting, on the other hand, is something that very much appeals to me. Maybe it was all those hours of Need for Speed Underground 2, but there's something about a car that goes sideways through a corner that makes me happy. Anyway, RC drifting is basically only in one class, 2-wheel drive, 10-scale, touring car drift cars. Each car is basically a touring car with the weight at the rear to help with swinging the weight at the back and forth like a pendulum. As for how competition works, it goes something like this. One car is sent out on a run to be judged on their own. How they perform dictates who they're up against in the following tandem rounds. In tandem runs, one car leads and the other follows. For the one that leads, it's their job to both drift well enough through the corners but also lose the person following. For the one following, it's their job to follow the lead car as physically close as possible without touching. 3 judges decide who did the better run, and you can get more favor with them by doing certain things like tapping points on the track or with certain parts of your car, and for the following car, slightly tapping the door of the lead car in a drift. Not to mention, in drifting, you're given a lot more freedom to do what you want in terms of the looks of the car. In fact, you're somewhat encouraged to make the car look as scale as possible to real drift cars. I mean, look at some of these rigs. It's also important to note that the drifting is pretty much the only RC sport that allows the use of a gyro. A gyro basically stabilizes the car on a turn and is almost essential for those starting out in the drifting scene. Overall, drifting is a fun part of ground RC racing, if you can call it racing. But if you don't want to deal with turns at all, that leads us into our last mainstream surface RC racing type. Drag racing is as simple as racing can get. A simple straight line, get from point A to B as quickly as possible. Or so I thought. The rabbit hole I've dove down for this section alone could warrant a whole video all to itself, but since I have almost no personal experience in drag racing, I'll just go over the basics. First, you have the various classes, and the first ones I want to go over are Street Eliminator, and basically a Run What You Brung class referred to as Outlaw. This is the premier drag racing class these days, but it wasn't too long ago when these kinds of cars didn't really exist. They originated not too long ago from people putting short course trucks and putting buggy suspension arms and drive shafts on them. Put a car body on it, and there you go, you have the Street Eliminator class. It's important to note that drag racing can be as expensive or as cheap as you realistically want it to be. You can either buy a number of RTR no prep drag cars out there and simply go out and race with a decent level of competitiveness, or you can spend a lot of money on hop-ups for aftermarket chassis and specific companies all you like. Keep in mind, however, just because you have a bigger wallet doesn't mean you'll be faster. There was a large $12,000 race in California a while ago, and the one who won it was a Traxxas Slash drag car that was pretty bare bones. Oh, and that reminds me. People put a lot of money into drag racing prize pools a lot of the time. Payout classes are abundant, so if you want to make money in RC racing, kind of, and you think you're good enough to drive in a straight line with some level of control, trust me, it's harder than it looks with a 3.5 turn motor, drag racing might be for you. Now, if you simply have too much money and think that 8th scale is for pussies, perhaps 5th scale gas truck is for you. Whether it be 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive trucks, These monsters are much more popular in rural parts of the US and Canada, where it's much more convenient, or legal, to own one of these things. The tracks themselves are always outdoors and are usually pretty rough. Because these cars are actually huge, they also come with a huge price tag. A low C5 can cost about $1,600, so for beginners it's absolutely hopeless. I've seen one of these things run once before, and it was an exciting, yet scary experience. I can't imagine marshalling for one of these things. In even more of an obscure form, we have 5th scale touring cars. These are some of the more unique cars you can buy. That is, if you can find them. They aren't on mainstream RC carriers, so you have to do a bit of digging to find them. They tend to be more popular in Europe, as touring car racing in general is more popular in Europe, and this is also the case with 5th scale gas Formula 1 racing. Yes, it's a thing. Now I know I didn't mention crawling in this video, but that's not really racing per se, even though I did mention drifting. The reason why I didn't mention crawling is because I want to dedicate an entire video onto itself. Also, it's important to note that this video only went over RC racing, not drones or boats. Those are separate worlds all to themselves. Overall, RC racing is a larger hobby than one might think, and it's a hobby worth being explored. That's all for now. If you liked the video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Also, if you want to support me another way, be sure to check out my Patreon where I post updates and ideas on my latest videos. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons Michael Williams, Lucas Tarka, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, and Ryan Lamb. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.